Good morning. Barry Bryson here. I'm thanking you again for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word. And today we're going to conclude our conversation about the Apostle Paul, talking really more about his life, his biography, his autobiography that we have in the New Testament more so than his thinking and his doctrine. We talked yesterday about his conversion. And we've been talking these last 2 days about how God has prepared Paul for his life of ministry in the same way Moses was prepared. It took so long to prepare Moses, and there was such a variety of education he had to have. He had to know how to negotiate the halls of Egypt. He had to know how to negotiate the desert. He knew how to know how to lead. And God took 80 years to prepare him to do that. And Paul similarly had a very broad education. He had a vocational education that would support him wherever he went as a worker in leather goods. He had a classical education that would allow him to use with ease the Greek authors, Roman authors, and philosophers of the classical world, and also just the best Hebrew education available at that time, perhaps at any time. And how all of these came together to make this man who started out as a racist and a violent, awful individual. I mean, we could almost think of him as a KKK kind of a person when he was with the backing of the government when he was a young man, to someone who was the advocate for Gentiles coming into the kingdom and taking the message of Christ to the Gentiles. Well, we know from the book of Acts that immediately after his baptism in Damascus, he begins to preach and begins to be persecuted and has to escape by night from that city. What we learn from Galatians, the first chapter, is that he doesn't immediately go up to Jerusalem, which we're told about next in the book of Acts. But there is an interval of 3 years in which he is basically a hermit in the Arabian desert, being trained by Jesus himself. And so he spends time, personal time, with Jesus and has an experience, a personal experience with Jesus like the other apostles would have had during Jesus' public ministry. And then Barnabas is the one who presents him. And Barnabas is also the one who goes back to Tarsus, finds him, and includes him in the ministry at Antioch. We read about that in Acts chapter 11. And of course, while he was there in that multicultural work, which was so explosive and so successful, we see him facing down Peter, an episode that we talked about earlier when we were talking about Peter. I wanted to look at a couple of passages, though, that just describe his life on the road as a traveling missionary and then during his prison years. And in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, he just tells us what life on the road for him is like when he just talks about all the things he's had to endure. He said, I was beaten times without number, often in danger of death. 5 times I received from the Jews 39 lashes. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I've spent in the deep ocean. I've been on frequent journeys, in dangers from rivers, dangers from robbers, dangers from my countrymen, dangers from the Gentiles, dangers in the city, dangers in the wilderness, dangers on the sea, dangers among false brethren. I have been in labor and hardship through many sleepless nights, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure, and apart from such external things, there is the daily pressure upon me of concern for all the churches. Who is weak without my being weak? I can't imagine what life on the road was like for Paul. I can't imagine the toll it took on his physical body. When he talks about his thorn in the flesh, whatever that was, no doubt this is a man whose body was just completely destroyed by his life on the road. That's why his years under house arrest that we read about at the end of the book of Acts are a time, to me, of rest for him, a time when he can focus on writing to the churches like Philippi and Ephesus and Colossae, writing to individuals like like Philemon. It's not till 2 Timothy that we read that Paul is in actual jail. And again, it's hard for him. Chapter 4 tells us that he doesn't have his coat. He's by himself. No one stands up with him. Luke has ministered to him, and that's about it. And he needs Timothy to come soon, because he's already escaped execution once. He will not escape execution again. And yet he is unbowed. He knows that Jesus is with him. The Lord stood with me, and I fought a good fight. I've finished the course. I've kept the faith. I know my crown is secure. Paul's an amazing, amazing man. We spent a lot more time on Peter. I think it's easier for us to feel emotional attachment to Peter. Paul is such a daunting individual. It's hard for us to associate with him. His intellect, his personal force is so strong. But man, we have been blessed by the Lord that such a man lived in the wake of Jesus' ministry and helped establish the kingdom and gave us an example to follow. Well, anyway, thank you for spending some time talking about Paul. We're going to talk more about Paul tomorrow and the next day. So we'll join you then to talk more about the Apostle Paul.